Warning! This episode of Data Dissonance contains political commentary, analysis of current events, and opinions protected under the First Amendment. Some material may be uncomfortable, inconvenient, or directly challenge narratives promoted by corporate media and government institutions. Listener discretion is advised. Not because this content is dangerous, but because truth often is to those who aren't used to hearing it without filters. If you're looking for comfort, reassurance, or carefully curated talking points, this probably isn't the show for you.
While most Americans are focused on Christmas lists, travel plans, and trying to squeeze a little piece out of a chaotic year, something very different is happening far from the holiday lights and shopping malls. Out at sea, quietly, deliberately, and with almost no media attention, the United States is enforcing power. Not issuing statements, not floating concerns, not leaking anonymous briefings. Actual enforcement. The U.S. Coast Guard is now in active pursuit of a third oil tanker tied to sanctioned Venezuelan oil, after already seizing two others, signaling that this administration isn't just talking about sanctions. It's enforcing them. And the timing is not accidental. Christmas week has always been Washington's favorite window to move hard while the public is distracted. And tonight we're breaking down what this maritime crackdown really means, who it's aimed at, and why silence from the media might be the loudest signal of all. All right, let's bring in the crew, because this story isn't just about oil tankers or sanctions. It's about enforcement, deterrence, and how power actually works when it's applied instead of announced. Joining me tonight is Brian, bringing the MAGA fire and that no-nonsense view that America doesn't need permission slips, apologies, or international lectures to enforce its own laws or protect its interests, especially when rogue regimes think holiday distractions equal weakness. We've got Rachel here as well, cutting straight through the noise to focus on the real-world implications, the economic pressure, the global ripple effects, and what this kind of enforcement signals to allies and adversaries watching closely. Daniel is with us too, connecting the dots most people miss. The timing, the strategy, and the quiet messages being sent not just to Venezuela, but to every power testing limits right now. And finally, Skylar is here to challenge the conversation from the progressive side, raising questions about humanitarian impact, transparency, and the long-term consequences of pressure campaigns, because understanding both the intent and the cost of power matters if we're going to have an honest discussion. This is Data and Dissonance, and tonight we're breaking down what it looks like when enforcement replaces excuses. This is one of those stories that would normally dominate headlines if it were happening in July or October. But because it's Christmas week, it's being treated like background noise, if it's being mentioned at all. The United States Coast Guard is currently in active pursuit of a third oil tanker linked to sanctioned Venezuelan oil, following the recent seizure of two others. And that is not a symbolic move. It's not a warning shot, and it's not diplomatic theater. That is enforcement. That is the United States saying sanctions are not just words on paper. They are lines you do not cross without consequences, even and especially when you think the world is distracted by holidays and year-end coverage. President Donald Trump has made it clear that Venezuelan oil sanctions are not optional, and that continued attempts to move sanctioned crude will be met with real action, not press releases. And what matters here isn't just Venezuela. It's who else is watching, who else is testing limits, and what it means when enforcement quietly replaces excuses. So let's start with Brian, because this is exactly the kind of story that separates tough talk from actual leadership.
This is what strength actually looks like, and it's something Americans haven't seen enough of over the last several years. No endless meetings, no strongly worded letters, no international hand-wringing, just action. Two tankers seized, a third being chased down, and suddenly every regime that's been playing games with U.S. sanctions realizes those games come with consequences again. This sends a very clear message, not just to Venezuela, but to every country and cartel that thinks sanctions are just suggestions if you move fast enough or hide behind shell companies. And the timing absolutely matters, because doing this during Christmas week proves there's no pause button on enforcement just because Americans are at home with their families. This is America saying, we don't stop protecting our interests because it's inconvenient for you. And let's be honest, this also exposes how hollow the last few years of so-called sanctions were, when no one was willing to back them up with force. Sanctions without enforcement are just theater. This is real.
And that's the key word. Real. Because for years, we've watched sanctions announced with great fanfare, only to be quietly ignored while regimes found workarounds and middlemen. Rachel, take this a step deeper for us, because enforcement like this doesn't happen in a vacuum. It has economic and global consequences.
This move matters because it fundamentally changes how sanctions are perceived on the world stage. When sanctions exist only on paper, they become part of the cost of doing business, especially in energy markets where demand never really stops. But when tankers start getting seized and pursued, the risk calculation changes overnight. Shipping companies, insurers, and middlemen suddenly have to ask whether it's worth losing an entire vessel and cargo to move sanctioned oil, and most of them decide it isn't. That pressure doesn't just squeeze the Venezuelan government. It sends a signal to global energy markets that enforcement is back on the table, which can temporarily tighten supply, but ultimately creates more stability by discouraging black market routes. It also puts pressure on countries that have been quietly buying or facilitating Venezuelan oil through indirect channels. This isn't reckless. It's targeted, strategic, and designed to make sanctions actually function the way they were intended to in the first place.
And that's where this gets bigger than just oil or one country, because enforcement always speaks louder than policy papers. Daniel, connect the dots here. Because this doesn't feel random, and it doesn't feel isolated.
Nothing about this is accidental, and nothing about the timing is coincidence. Christmas week is historically when governments move quietly because attention is low and reaction time is slow, and that works both ways. It's when bad actors try to slip things through, and it's when strong governments act, knowing there will be less political noise. What's happening here isn't just about stopping Venezuelan oil. It's about reasserting control over global supply routes and reminding the world who still has the capability and willingness to enforce red lines at sea. This message isn't just for President Nicolas Maduro or even Venezuela. It's for Iran, for Russia, for China, and for anyone else testing how fragmented or distracted the United States might be. Maritime enforcement is one of the clearest demonstrations of power because it can't be ignored, spun, or blurred like photos on social media. When a tanker is seized, that's reality, and reality has a way of cutting through propaganda very quickly.
All right. And before we wrap this segment, I want to bring in Skylar, because the left tends to frame any kind of enforcement like this as aggression, imperialism, or bullying. And that framing matters because it shapes how regular people interpret strength, deterrence, and consequences. Skylar, from your perspective, what's the real argument against this? And what do you think people on your side are missing when they automatically recoil at the idea of the US stopping sanctioned oil at sea?
So here's where I'm going to be blunt, because I actually think there are two conversations happening at once, and most people only want to have the easy one. The easy one is to say, sanctions bad, or US policing the world. And yes, historically, enforcement actions have sometimes been used as cover for bigger geopolitical agendas, and people on the left remember that. But the harder conversation is this. If sanctions exist at all, and if they're supposedly meant to target regimes rather than people, then enforcement has to be consistent and transparent, or else you're just creating a black market that rewards corruption and punishes ordinary civilians through scarcity and price hikes. The concern I have is not the Coast Guard doing its job. It's the lack of public clarity about the endgame and the humanitarian consequences. Because whenever we squeeze an economy hard, the people who suffer first are not the elites, it's the working families, the sick, the poor, the ones without options. And on top of that, energy enforcement can create ripple effects that hit regular Americans too, because global oil is interconnected whether anyone wants to admit it or not. So if the administration is going to do this, and clearly it is, then it should be paired with a clear public explanation. What exactly is the objective? What conditions end the blockade posture? And how do we ensure it doesn't become an endless pressure campaign that looks strong on TV but leaves people trapped under a regime with no off-ramp? I'm not saying do nothing. I'm saying don't pretend power is clean. And if you're going to use it, be honest about what it costs and why you're doing it.
That right there is the divide, and it's an important one to hear out loud. On one side, the argument is that sanctions without enforcement are fake and invite more lawlessness. On the other side, the warning is that pressure campaigns can turn into endless chokeholds that punish civilians while regimes adapt and survive. But here's what's undeniable tonight. The United States is not just talking about Venezuelan oil sanctions anymore. It's enforcing them in real time, with real assets, with real consequences, and the Coast Guard being in active pursuit of a third tanker after seizing two is a flashing sign that this administration is willing to do what most governments only threaten to do. And that means the real question becomes bigger than Venezuela. How many other actors are watching this and recalculating right now? And how many other operations are happening during Christmas week because everyone assumes Americans are too distracted to notice? That's the point. The timing, the silence, and the shift from paperwork to enforcement. All right, coming up next, we're going to hit you with a quick merch drop, and then we'll close this episode the way we always do, with some final thoughts that put all of this into perspective while the rest of the country is trying to hold on to the season. Before we wrap things up tonight, quick reminder. Data and Dissonance doesn't answer to corporate sponsors, political parties, or billion-dollar media conglomerates. This show exists because listeners like you choose to support independent voices, especially during weeks like this when real stories are quietly happening while the media looks the other way. If you want to back the work we do here, head over to the Data and Dissonance merch store and check out the winter lineup. Hoodies built for cold morning drives, mugs and tumblers for those long nights paying attention when everyone else is tuned out, and our coffee blends roasted in the USA for people who like their mornings strong and their media unfiltered. Every purchase helps keep this show independent, uncensored, and moving forward into the new year. Links are in the show description. And as always, supporting the merch means you're supporting the mission. Not just a brand, but the ability to keep telling stories that don't get told anywhere else. This is one of those weeks where it would be easy to look away, to tell ourselves that politics can wait until after the holidays, that we'll deal with the bigger issues once the decorations come down and the calendar flips. And that instinct is human. Families matter, moments matter, and this season reminds us of what we're supposed to be protecting in the first place. But power doesn't take a holiday, and history shows us that some of the most consequential moves happen precisely when people assume nothing important is happening. What we saw out at sea this week wasn't theater, and it wasn't a talking point. It was enforcement. Quiet and deliberate, happening while the country's attention was elsewhere. And whether you support it, question it, or sit somewhere in between, ignoring it doesn't make it go away. Awareness is part of citizenship, even when it's inconvenient. There's also a bigger lesson here about credibility and trust, because for years, Americans have been told that sanctions, warnings, and strongly worded statements were enough to keep bad actors in check. But when rules exist without consequences, they don't create order. They create loopholes, black markets, and cynicism. What changes behavior isn't volume or virtue signaling. It's consistency and follow-through. And that applies just as much at home as it does abroad. Borders, laws, energy policy, and enforcement all live or die on whether the people in charge are willing to back them up when it's hard, quiet, or unpopular. Strength doesn't always look loud, and it doesn't always come with applause. But it does show itself in actions that don't need a press conference to be real. As we head into Christmas, my hope is that people can hold both things at once: the joy of the season and the responsibility of paying attention. You can love your family, protect your peace, and still stay engaged with what's shaping the world your kids are going to inherit. Independence doesn't mean isolation, and patriotism doesn't mean blind loyalty. It means caring enough to stay informed, to question narratives, and to support voices that aren't afraid to speak when it would be easier to stay quiet. However you spend the next few days, be present with the people who matter. Stay curious about the things that don't make the headlines. And remember to speak truth. Stir thought. Tonight's episode of Data and Dissonance is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller series. A political suspense saga built for readers who know the world isn't as simple as the headlines make it. If you like stories where power operates in the shadows, enforcement replaces empty promises, and truth comes at a cost, you'll feel right at home in the Covenant Protocol and the Prophet Directive, with Book 3, Black Echo Rising, continuing the fight where the lines between loyalty, truth, and survival get razor thin. These aren't escapist fantasies. They're cautionary tales wrapped in action, written for people who pay attention. You can find the entire series right now on Amazon. Links are in the show description. Read what the media won't say out loud.